To increase your app market size, the most important features of your app is to support multilingual. Today, I'm going to show you how to localize a React Native app to support multilingual. Welcome back to Just Code China. Please support us by subscribing to our channel and like our video. If you have any question in this tutorial, please leave a comment below. Today's tutorial, we will continue to modify the dictionary app we had created in the past tutorial to illustrate how to enable multilingual support. Before we start coding, we need to install an npm module required by the new feature we're going to build. Let's bring up our terminal screen. Make sure you are in the project root folder. The module we're going to install is the React Native Localization module. Just type yarn add React Native Localization and press enter. After the module install, issue port install command to complete the installation. The installation had completed. Let's bring out the VS Code with the project folder open. Before we start modify the code, let me list out what is the changes we're going to make. We will create a new setting page to allow the user to change the language of the app. Once the user selects the language to use, the app will update the user interface language and save the setting into the device storage. In the subsequent launch, the app will check is there any language setting in the storage. If have, it will use it, or else it will default to English language. Now, let us start to modify the code. First, open up the helper.js file. We will add in two methods to read and save language setting from and to the device storage. The first method is the async get device language from storage method. It will read the device storage for the language setting and return it to the caller. If there is no setting in the storage, then it will return the default language code for English. The next method is the update device language to storage method, which saves the language setting received by the language parameter to the device storage. Now, we are going to modify the existing components to use React Native Localization module to display the UI text based on the user language setting. First, we need to define the different language text to be displayed within the app. We can save all the UI text in a single JSON file to be used by the entire app, or we can have a JSON file for each component to save the UI text. I would prefer to have a JSON file for each component. The first component we are going to modify is the app component in the app.js file. We first create a file called local.json in the same folder of app.js file. Within the file, we will define all the different language tags in the JSON object. The first level element in the JSON file will always be the language code the app going to support. For example, we will support the English EN, Chinese ZH, and Korean KR language within the app. In each language element, you can define your own structure of the JSON object to hold the text. It can be as simple as name-value pair or complex JSON structure. No matter how you structure the JSON file, make it easy to read and meaningful. In app.js file, we first import the helper and React Native Localization module. Then, we load the local.json file we had just created and assign it to the variable local file. Next, we will instantiate the localized string object by passing the local file variable as a parameter and assign it to the localized string variable. Next, we will define the language state and assign en as a default value for the app component. In the app component mount method, we will load the user language setting from the device storage by calling the getDeviceLanguageFromStorage method and update the language state accordingly. If we fail to load the setting, then we will set the language state to English as the default language. Since the localized text is displayed on the user interface, therefore, we will set the language of localized string object in the render method by passing in the language state. The reason to call setLanguage in render method is that when there is a state change in language, it will force the component to render the UI again with the latest language selected. Next, we will replace all the hard-coded text in the JSX to localized text. The app component render method didn't use any text in the UI. Instead, it is the sub-component in the JSX uses the text. However, to let the sub-component know which language to use, we need to pass the language state to all sub-components that depend on the language as a property. Let's modify the drawer NAV and camera sub-component in the JSX to pass in the language state as shown. Let's scroll up to the drawer NAV component section. We will replace the hard-coded text in the option title for each of the drawer string. To access the localized text, we simply use localized string object followed by the object property with the same structure defined in the local JSON file. There's one more thing we need to do in drawer NAV component. That is, we need to pass the language property to the underlying components, that NAV and profile. If you think that by passing the language property from drawer NAV to the drawer.screen element in the JSX will let the underlying component to receive the language property, then you are wrong. The reason is the drawer.screen itself is a component, and the component property in drawer.screen hold the component that drawer.screen will use to render the UI when the user select the menu item in the side menu. The drawer.screen component will not pass all the properties it received to the underlying component it used to render the UI. To overcome this issue, we need to use the child element to pass the underlying component instead of using the component property as shown. In the tab NAV and profile child element, we will pass in the entire drawer NAV props as shown. This ensures the language property in the drawer NAV props will be passed now to the underlying component. Let us scroll now to the drawer content component. In this component, we will just replace the hard-coded text in drawer item element will do. Next, scroll to the tab NAV component. We will perform the same operation as drawer NAV by replace the title with localized text and use child element to pass in the underlying component with properties as shown. We have completed the changes for app.js file. Next, we need to modify all custom and page components to utilize the localized text. The first component we're going to modify is the camera module. We first create a local.json file under the camera folder and specify all the language text in the file and save it. Now, open the index.js file under the camera folder. The changes we are going to make will be similar across all custom and page components. We first import the React Native Localization module. load the locale.json file and instantiate the localized string object. Then, in the render method, we will set the language for the localized string object by passing in the language code from the props. In the JSX, replace all hard-coded text to localized text. Followed by, we define the lang prop types and its default value at the end of the file. We had done for the camera module. The header and word def module is not required to use the localized text. The reason is the header module receives the text to be displayed from the caller, and the word def module displays the text received from the API call. Now, we will fast forward the similar changes for word selector and all page components under the screen folder. We have completed all the changes for all existing components. Now, let us start the JustCode DICT app in the iOS simulator. The app has launched in the simulator. However, you won't see any difference in the app as the default language is English. Now, we are going to create a setting page to allow the user to change the language based on his or her preference. Let's create a setting folder under the screen folder. In the setting folder, we will create a locale.json file first. Let's define all the text we need in the setting page component and save the file. Next, we will create an index.js file under the setting folder. Then, we import all the required modules, including those for supporting localized text. Followed by, we will create the setting class component. In it, we will define the class constructor and the initial language state to the language code passed in by the props. We then define the update language method to allow user to update the language selection. In it, we will update the setting component language state, followed by calling the helper update device language to storage method to save the user language selection into the device storage. Now, we will define the render method for the setting page component. We start by defining the header with localized text, then display a prompt with localized text. Then, we create a view to encapsulate three touchable opacity objects as the language selector for the user to select the language they prefer. In each of the touchable opacity objects, we will display the language flag and text. We will assign the touchable opacity on press event to the update language method and pass in the selected language code. Next, we will define all the styles required by the setting component. Last but not least, we will use a functional component to wrap around setting component to pass in the navigation object as shown. We have completed the setting component. To use the setting component in the app, we need to add it into the tab nav in app.js file as shown. Let's save the files and wait for the simulator to reload the application. The application had reloaded, and let us tap on the Setting tab to display the setting page. In the setting page, let us select Chinese language, and you will see the page header and prompt text will change to the Chinese text. However, do you notice the text in the side menu and footer didn't change to the Chinese text? The reason is that in the update language method, we only update the language state belong to the setting component. However, the side menu, drawer NAV, and footer tab NAV component is a nested component within the app component. In the last tutorial, I mentioned that each component only can access state belong to itself. Therefore, the side menu and footer language still remain in English, even though the language state in setting component has changed to Chinese. To overcome this issue, we must have a way to allow setting component to inform app component on the language change. To achieve that, let us create an update app language method in the app.js file as shown. Within this method, we will invoke the helper update device language to storage method to save the language change to the device storage, followed by update the app component language state. We then pass this method as a property to drawer NAV so that it will pass it down to all other components. Now, let's switch back to the setting component. We will invoke the update app language method from the property if defined. Next, we will remove the update device language to storage method, as the update app language will also invoke the same method. Let's save all the changes and wait for the app to reload. Now, let's go to the setting page again and select Korean language. You will see the entire app language will change based on the user selection. Let's force the app to reload again, and you will see the app display the UI based on the language the user has selected. From the demonstration, we had seen how troublesome to pass the component state as props and to update the top-level component state from a nested component. That's why in our next tutorial, I'm going to introduce you to the React Redux State Engine, which will solve all the issues we faced in this and the previous tutorial. So, stay tuned to our channel. We have come to the end of this tutorial. Today, I show you how to localize the React Native app to support multiple languages. This will help your app to get more user download without language barrier. If you have any question regarding this tutorial, please feel free to leave a comment below. You can follow the link to get the source code for the app in this tutorial on our GitHub page. Don't forget to change the Oxford API app ID and key to yours, and to generate your own Fire-based config file for iOS and Android. If you find our video useful, do support us by like our video, subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell. Thanks for watching. Bye.